Deep in North America's hunting territories, even the most experienced outdoorsmen find themselves outmatched. These aren't just tales of missed shots or bad weather. These are raw, chilling accounts where rifles failed, instincts faltered, and nature pushed back hard. From remote Alaskan valleys to fog-choked Oregon ridges, every encounter shows just how thin the line between hunter and hunted can be. This video brings you real-life hunting ordeals where survival hinged on seconds, and the enemy wasn't always what they expected. From reckless mistakes to near-death encounters, here's what unfolded in the wild. The remote drainage area west of Tok, Alaska, had earned its reputation among seasoned hunters as one of the most challenging terrains in the state. The region stretched across thousands of acres of untouched wilderness, characterized by dense alder thickets that could swallow a man whole and steep ridges that tested even the most experienced outdoorsmen. The area had been carved by glacial activity thousands of years ago, leaving behind a maze of valleys and creek beds that provided perfect habitat for Alaska's largest game animal. Local indigenous tribes had hunted these lands for centuries, passing down stories of massive bears that ruled the territory with an iron paw. In 2023, Leonard Haskell, a 57-year-old veteran hunter from Fairbanks, had been planning this particular moose hunt for over a year. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel of his pickup truck as he navigated the rough logging road that would take him and his hunting partner to their base camp. Leonard had been hunting Alaska's wilderness for nearly 3 decades, and his success rate was legendary among his peers. He attributed much of his success to his trusted .308 Winchester bolt-action rifle, a weapon he had carried faithfully for 20 years. The rifle had taken down countless moose, caribou, and black bears, never once failing him when it mattered most. Dale Raymond, Leonard's lifelong hunting partner, sat in the passenger seat, reviewing their hunting permits and studying topographical maps of the area. The two men had been hunting together for 15 years, and their partnership had become the stuff of local legend. Dale was known for his exceptional tracking skills and his ability to read animal behavior like a book. He had suggested this particular drainage area after hearing rumors from other hunters about the massive bull moose that frequented the willow-choked creeks during the rutting season. Their first 3 days in the wilderness passed without incident. The men established their camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees, complete with a meat cache suspended high above the ground to protect their supplies from scavengers. Leonard felt confident in their setup, having used similar configurations dozens of times before. The weather had been cooperative, with clear skies and temperatures hovering around 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the day. On the 4th morning, while glassing a clearing near a creek lined with dense willow brush, Leonard noticed something that made his blood run cold. At first glance, he thought he was looking at tracks left by a large bull moose. But when Dale examined them more closely, the reality became terrifyingly clear. The prints measured nearly 12 inches long and 8 inches wide, with claw marks extending another 4 inches beyond the toe pads. Dale had seen plenty of grizzly tracks in his lifetime, but nothing that even approached this size. Leonard tried to rationalize what they were seeing, suggesting that perhaps the soft ground had caused the tracks to appear larger than they actually were. Dale shook his head grimly, pointing out that the depth of the impressions indicated an animal of extraordinary weight. He estimated that whatever had made these tracks weighed at least 1,500 pounds, possibly more. The two men decided to relocate their camp immediately, but fate had other plans. That evening, as they prepared their dinner over a small camp stove, Leonard noticed an unusual silence had fallen over the forest. The typical sounds of squirrels chattering and birds calling had disappeared entirely, replaced by an oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. Dale looked up from his meal, his expression troubled. He mentioned that he had experienced this phenomenon before, always preceding encounters with large predators. The attack came without warning. Leonard was reaching for his rifle when he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing just outside the ring of firelight. Before either man could react, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the darkness, its shoulder hump rising nearly 5 feet above the ground. The bear's eyes reflected the firelight like amber jewels, and its massive head swayed back and forth as it assessed the two intruders in its territory. Leonard's training kicked in automatically. He raised his .308 Winchester and fired 3 shots in rapid succession, each bullet finding its mark center mass on the bear's chest. The sound of the gunshots echoed through the valley like thunder, but the bear's reaction was what would haunt Leonard for the rest of his life. The massive creature didn't even flinch. It stood there for several seconds as if contemplating whether the minor inconvenience of being shot was worth pursuing further. The bear's next move was calculated and deliberate. Instead of charging, it began to circle their camp slowly, staying just outside the firelight. Leonard and Dale scrambled up a nearby boulder outcrop, using their hands and feet to climb 15 feet above the ground. From their precarious perch, they watched in horror as the bear methodically destroyed their camp, shredding their tent and scattering their gear across the clearing. What disturbed Leonard most was the bear's behavior. It didn't act like a typical grizzly driven by hunger or territorial instincts. Instead, it displayed an almost human-like patience, settling down at the base of the boulder and waiting. Throughout the night, the bear remained vigilant, occasionally standing and swiping at the rock face with claws that left gouges in the stone. By morning, the bear had vanished as silently as it had appeared, but it had taken their entire meat cache with it. Leonard and Dale spent the next 2 days hiking out of the wilderness, surviving on the small amount of food they had managed to salvage from their destroyed camp. Both men were severely dehydrated and shaken by the experience. Leonard never used his .308 Winchester again. He traded it for a .375 H and H Magnum the following week, but he admitted to friends that it wasn't the bear's size that rattled him most. It was the creature's patience, the way it had waited throughout the night like a sentinel, that convinced him he had encountered something beyond the realm of ordinary wildlife. The Bitterstone Ridge region of western Montana had served as prime black bear habitat for generations, with its unique blend of pine and oak forests creating an ideal ecosystem for the area's thriving bear population. In 1989, Franklin Donnelly, known to his friends and family as Frank, had been hunting these same ridges for over 2 decades. At 43 years old, he possessed the kind of woodcraft that only came from countless hours spent in the wilderness. His weathered hands showed the calluses of a man who had spent more time gripping a rifle than a desk, and his keen eyes could spot signs that most hunters would walk right past. Frank had built his reputation on his ability to pattern black bears, understanding their feeding habits and travel routes with an almost supernatural precision. Eric Mathis, Frank's 22-year-old nephew, had been begging his uncle to take him on a bear hunt for 3 years. The young man had grown up in suburban Denver, spending his summers visiting Frank's ranch, but never venturing into serious hunting territory. Eric possessed enthusiasm, but lacked the patience and woods sense that his uncle had developed over decades of hunting. Frank had finally agreed to take Eric along, partly because he wanted to pass on his knowledge to the next generation, and partly because he figured the experience would either make Eric a real hunter or cure him of his romantic notions about wilderness adventures. The tree stand Frank had chosen overlooked a natural travel corridor where bears move between feeding areas and their bedding sites. He had spent weeks during the summer months scouting this particular location, noting the claw marks on trees and the well-worn trails that indicated regular bear activity. The stand itself was a sturdy wooden platform built 12 feet above the ground, secured to a massive pine tree with heavy-duty bolts and cable supports. Frank had constructed it himself the previous spring, using materials designed to withstand Montana's harsh winters. On their third day of hunting, Frank and Eric had settled into the stand before dawn, their .306 rifles resting against the platform's rail. The morning had been uneventful, with only a few squirrels and a curious porcupine providing entertainment. Frank had been teaching Eric about reading signs and understanding animal behavior when the large black bear appeared without warning at the edge of the clearing. The bear was a mature boar, probably weighing close to 300 pounds, with the distinctive shoulder hump and broad skull that marked him as a dominant male. Frank estimated the animal's age at around 8 years old, prime breeding age for a black bear in this region. The bear moved with the confidence of an animal that had never encountered serious threats, casually investigating the bait pile Frank had placed 30 yards from the base of their tree. Eric's excitement got the better of him, and he shifted his position to get a better view of the bear. The movement caused the wooden platform to creak slightly, but in the stillness of the forest, the sound carried clearly to the bear's sensitive ears. The massive animal looked up immediately, its small black eyes scanning the tree until they locked onto the two hunters perched above. What happened next defied every piece of conventional wisdom Frank had learned about black bear behavior. Instead of fleeing or ignoring the human presence, the bear stood on its hind legs and began climbing the tree. Frank watched in horror as the animal's powerful claws found purchase in the pine bark, pulling its considerable bulk upward with surprising agility. The bear climbed until its massive head was only 6 feet below the platform, close enough that Frank could smell its musky scent and see the saliva dripping from its partially open mouth. Frank's rifle was strapped to a nearby branch, completely out of reach. In his 20 years of hunting from tree stands, he had never imagined a scenario where he would need his weapon while actually in the stand. The bear began testing the platform's stability, using its powerful claws to scrape at the wooden planks and support cables. Each swipe sent vibrations through the structure that Frank could feel in his bones. For the next 3 hours, the bear maintained its position beneath the platform, occasionally climbing part way up the tree to investigate the two trapped hunters. Frank later described the experience as the longest 3 hours of his life, watching the bear's methodical attempts to reach them while being completely helpless to defend themselves. The animal showed no signs of losing interest, instead displaying a patience that suggested it was prepared to wait indefinitely. As darkness fell, Frank began to worry about their long-term survival. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and neither man had dressed for an extended stay in the tree. Their flashlight batteries died around midnight, leaving them in complete darkness, with only the occasional sound of the bear moving below to remind them of their predicament. The bear finally departed sometime after 2 in the morning, apparently spooked by a pack of coyotes howling in the distance. Frank and Eric waited until dawn before climbing down from their perch, both men shaking from a combination of cold and residual fear. Eric didn't hunt again for 6 years, and when he finally returned to the woods, he insisted on hunting from the ground. Frank reinforced all his tree stands with aluminum supports the following season, but he never again hunted without his rifle within arm's reach. The rolling farmland surrounding Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan had always been known for its harsh winters and unpredictable weather patterns. In 1972, Rupert Griggs had called this harsh landscape home for over 30 years. At 61 years old, he was a man shaped by decades of physical labor and prairie winters. His hands bore the permanent stains of locomotive grease and railroad coal, evidence of his 40-year career with the railway. Rupert had retired the previous spring, trading his engineer's cap for a trapper's hat and embracing the solitary life he had always craved. His small farmstead consisted of a modest house, a chicken coop, and several outbuildings where he stored his trapping equipment and processed the pelts he collected during the winter months. The first signs of trouble had appeared 3 weeks earlier when Rupert discovered deep claw marks gouged into the wooden walls of his chicken coop. The marks were too large and too high to have been made by any of the local predators he was familiar with. Coyotes, foxes, and the occasional wolf were common in the area, but none of them possessed the size or strength necessary to leave such dramatic evidence of their presence. Rupert had initially dismissed the marks as the work of a particularly large black bear, reasoning that the animal had probably been attracted by the scent of his chickens and moved on when it couldn't gain access to the coop. His trapline stretched across nearly 10 square miles of prairie and woodland, covering territory that Rupert had been exploring since his arrival in Saskatchewan. He had established over 50 trap sites, each one carefully positioned to take advantage of natural wildlife corridors and feeding areas. His primary targets were snowshoe hares, red foxes, and the occasional beaver, all of which provided pelts that commanded good prices at the regional fur auctions. Rupert carried a Ruger .22 rifle during his trap runs, not for protection, but as a humane way to dispatch any animals that might still be alive when he checked his sets. The October morning when everything changed had started like any other. A thick fog had rolled in from the northwest during the night, reducing visibility to less than 20 feet and creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to muffle even the slightest sounds. Rupert had been checking his trapline for over 2 hours when he discovered that his largest snare had been dragged nearly 40 yards through the underbrush. The steel cable had been stretched and twisted beyond repair, and the anchor post had been pulled completely out of the ground. Following the drag trail through the dense spruce thicket, Rupert expected to find the remains of a large hare or perhaps a fox that had managed to escape before dying. Instead, he stumbled upon a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. A juvenile grizzly bear, probably weighing around 200 pounds, was feeding on the hindquarters of a frozen deer carcass. Rupert's first thought was disbelief. Grizzlies were almost unheard of in Saskatchewan, with most confined to the western provinces and northern territories. In all his years trapping these lands, he had never encountered one, nor had any of the old-timers he knew. The sight of the distinctive shoulder hump and dished face profile left no doubt about what he was looking at. The bear's presence here was unusual enough, but what disturbed Rupert most was the animal's behavior when it noticed him. Most bears, when surprised by human presence, would either flee immediately or display aggressive posturing designed to intimidate potential threats. This bear did neither. Instead, it raised its massive head, looked directly at Rupert, and seemed to weigh its options with an intelligence that bordered on unsettling. Rupert later described the moment as feeling like he was being evaluated by a predator that understood exactly what kind of threat he represented. Rupert's first instinct was to fire a warning shot over the bear's head, hoping to frighten it away without escalating the situation. He raised his .22 rifle and squeezed the trigger, sending a small caliber bullet whistling through the fog above the bear's shoulders. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trees, but the bear's reaction was immediate and terrifying. Instead of fleeing, it lowered its head, flattened its ears against its skull, and charged directly at Rupert with a speed that seemed impossible for such a large animal. Rupert dropped his rifle and scrambled toward the nearest climbable tree, a sturdy fir with branches low enough to reach. The bear covered the 30-foot distance between them in seconds, arriving at the base of the tree just as Rupert managed to swing his legs up onto the lowest branch. The bear's powerful claws raked across his left hand as he pulled himself higher, the razor-sharp tips slicing through flesh and bone with horrifying efficiency. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but Rupert managed to climb high enough to escape the bear's reach. He looked down at his mangled hand and realized that 2 of his fingers were missing entirely, severed cleanly at the second knuckle. Blood was streaming down his arm, soaking his jacket sleeve and dripping onto the bear that continued to pace beneath the tree. The bear maintained its vigil throughout the night, occasionally standing on its hind legs to swipe at the lower branches, but never attempting to climb. Rupert used his belt as a tourniquet to control the bleeding, but he knew that his survival depended on the bear losing interest and moving on. The fog continued to swirl around them, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the entire experience feel like a nightmare. By dawn, the bear had finally departed, leaving Rupert to climb down from his perch and begin the long journey back to his farmstead. He managed to reach his house and drive himself to the nearest medical facility where doctors confirmed that his ring finger and pinky finger had been completely severed. When the local newspaper ran a story about the attack, wildlife officials were as stunned as anyone. Grizzly sightings in Saskatchewan were so rare that this incident would be talked about for decades. The bear's presence so far from typical grizzly habitat became part of the legend, and from that day forward, everyone in the area knew him as Three-Finger Rupert. Rupert continued trapping for another 15 years, but he never again ventured into the wilderness without a .45-70 government rifle slung across his shoulder. He claimed that the experience had taught him to respect the intelligence of large predators, and he never again underestimated what a determined bear could accomplish when it set its mind to something. The Cascade Ridge area of eastern Oregon stretched across thousands of acres of dense coniferous forest within the Whispering Pines National Forest, creating one of the most challenging hunting environments in the Pacific Northwest. It was 2014, and Benjamin Knox had driven from Salem specifically to hunt this challenging terrain, drawn by reports of large bull elk that use the ridge's remote valleys as refuge during hunting season. At 36 years old, Benjamin possessed the kind of patience and persistence that made him an exceptional bow hunter. He had been perfecting his archery skills for over 15 years, and his success rate with traditional bow and arrow was legendary among his hunting partners. Benjamin preferred the increased challenge of bow hunting over rifle hunting, believing that the close-range encounters required for bow shots created a more meaningful connection with the animals he pursued. His hunting partners for this expedition were 2 longtime friends from the Salem area, both experienced hunters who had accompanied Benjamin on previous elk hunts throughout Oregon and Washington. The 3 men had established a base camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering Douglas firs, complete with wall tents and a camp kitchen that could sustain them for a week-long hunt. They planned to split up each morning and cover different areas of the ridge, using handheld radios to maintain contact and coordinate their efforts. On the fourth day of their hunt, Benjamin had been tracking a herd of elk across a ridgeline when the weather suddenly deteriorated. A thick fog bank rolled in from the west, reducing visibility to less than 10 feet and creating an eerie atmosphere that seemed to muffle all sound. The fog was unlike anything Benjamin had experienced before, so dense that he could barely see his own feet as he moved through the underbrush. His GPS unit lost satellite signal almost immediately, and he realized that his compass had somehow been damaged during the morning's hike. What began as a minor navigational challenge quickly escalated into a serious survival situation. Benjamin found himself in unfamiliar territory, surrounded by identical-looking trees and rock formations that provided no useful landmarks. The fog seemed to distort sound as well as sight, making it impossible to determine direction or distance. He tried calling out to his hunting partners, but his voice seemed to be absorbed by the thick moisture in the air, producing only muffled echoes that provided no useful information about his location. After several hours of wandering through the fog, Benjamin became aware that he was no longer alone. The first indication was the sound of branches breaking behind him, occurring at regular intervals that suggested something large was following his trail. Initially, Benjamin assumed that one of his hunting partners had managed to track him down and was approaching from behind. He called out several times but received no response other than the continued sound of steady footsteps matching his own pace. The realization that he was being stalked by something other than a human came gradually. The breathing he heard behind him was too deep and too labored to come from a person, and the smell that occasionally reached his nostrils was distinctly animal-like. Benjamin had encountered black bears and cougars during previous hunts, but this seemed different somehow. The presence behind him displayed a patience that suggested a large predator that had learned to be cautious around humans. Benjamin's decision to climb a tree was driven by pure instinct rather than rational analysis. He found a sturdy pine with branches low enough to reach and hauled himself up to a height of about 15 feet. From his perch, he could see slightly better through the fog, but what he observed made his blood run cold. A massive silhouette was moving through the trees below him, its shoulder hump clearly visible even in the limited visibility. The creature was enormous, easily the largest bear Benjamin had ever seen, and it seemed to be searching for him with methodical persistence. What happened next challenged Benjamin's understanding of bear behavior. Instead of losing interest and moving on, the bear seemed to understand exactly where Benjamin was hiding. It began disturbing the ground around the base of his tree, occasionally knocking loose stones and debris that clattered against the trunk below him. The bear's movements caused rocks to roll down the slope toward his position, and at times it seemed almost deliberate, though Benjamin realized this could simply be the result of a large animal moving through unstable terrain. Benjamin remained motionless in the tree throughout the night, listening to the bear moving around below him but never seeing it clearly enough to identify its exact location. The fog continued to swirl around them, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the entire experience feel like a nightmare. Occasionally, he would hear the bear's breathing directly beneath him, so close that he could feel its presence like a physical weight in the air. By dawn, the fog had finally begun to lift, and Benjamin found himself alone in the tree. The bear had vanished as silently as it had appeared, leaving behind only disturbed ground and scattered stones and debris from its movements around the base of the tree. Benjamin climbed down from his perch and began the long process of finding his way back to camp, following game trails and hoping to intersect with familiar landmarks. He spent the next 2 days wandering through the forest, surviving on the small amount of food he carried in his day pack and drinking from stream water he purified with iodine tablets. By the time he reached a logging road and flagged down a passing truck, Benjamin was severely dehydrated and beginning to hallucinate from exhaustion and stress. The truck driver later described Benjamin as looking like he had seen a ghost, with wild eyes and an inability to explain coherently what had happened to him. Benjamin never returned to Cascade Ridge, despite numerous invitations from his hunting partners. He claimed that the experience had taught him to respect the intelligence of large predators, and he never again ventured into unfamiliar territory without multiple backup navigation systems. When pressed for details about his encounter, Benjamin would only say that whatever had been following him that day possessed an intelligence that was far more sophisticated than he had expected from a wild animal, and he had no desire to test its patience a second time. The southern Georgia pine barrens stretched across thousands of acres of dense, longleaf pine forest, creating one of the most challenging hunting environments in the southeastern United States. In 2007, Hank Prescott had been hunting the Georgia pine barrens for over 20 years, establishing himself as one of the region's most successful hog hunters. At 48 years old, he possessed the kind of woodcraft that came from countless hours spent tracking dangerous game through some of the most challenging terrain in the South. His weathered hands showed the scars of numerous encounters with wounded hogs, and his reputation among local hunters was built on his ability to find and kill the largest boars in the area. Hank's weapon of choice was an AR-10 rifle chambered in .308 Winchester, a semi-automatic platform that provided the rapid follow-up shots necessary when dealing with multiple hogs or particularly aggressive individuals. Willie Dean, Hank's 52-year-old cousin, had been hunting with Hank for over a decade. Willie was known throughout the region for his skill with a lever-action rifle, particularly his scoped .35 Remington that he had inherited from his father. The two men had developed a hunting partnership that bordered on telepathic, with each man instinctively knowing where the other would be positioned during their coordinated drives through the dense pine forests. Willie's knowledge of hog behavior complemented Hank's tracking abilities, creating a team that consistently produced results when other hunters returned empty-handed. Their hunting camp was located deep in the pine barrens, accessible only by a series of abandoned logging roads that required four-wheel drive vehicles to navigate. The camp consisted of 2 canvas wall tents, a cooking area with a propane stove, and a meat processing station where they could field dress and butcher their kills. Hank had chosen this location because it was situated near several active hog feeding areas, places where the animals came to root for acorns and other food sources. The camp was also positioned to take advantage of natural wind patterns, ensuring that their human scent would be carried away from the areas they planned to hunt. The first 3 days of their hunt had been exceptionally successful. Hank and Willie had killed 6 hogs ranging in size from 50 to 200 pounds, providing enough meat to fill both of their chest freezers back home. They had also encountered sign of much larger animals, including tracks that suggested the presence of a boar weighing well over 300 pounds. The two men had nicknamed this unseen giant the Mule due to the size of its tracks and the aggressive way it had torn up the ground in several feeding areas. The first indication that the Mule had found their camp came on the 4th night, when both men were awakened by the sound of their cook stove being overturned. Hank grabbed his AR-10 and carefully unzipped the tent flap, expecting to see a black bear or perhaps a smaller hog investigating their cooking area. Instead, he found himself face to face with the largest wild boar he had ever seen. The animal stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder, with tusks that extended 6 inches beyond its lower jaw, and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate Hank as a potential threat. The boar's behavior was unlike anything Hank had experienced in his 20 years of hog hunting. Instead of fleeing when confronted by human presence, the mule seemed to be deliberately testing their defenses. It methodically destroyed their cooking area, overturning pots and pans with casual swipes of its massive head. When Hank fired a warning shot over the animal's head, the mule looked directly at him, seemed to consider its options, and then trotted off into the darkness with an attitude that suggested it was merely postponing the confrontation rather than abandoning it. The second night's attack was more aggressive and systematic. The mule returned around midnight, this time focusing its attention on their meat cache. The boar had somehow learned to identify the location of their stored game, and it methodically tore through their tarp-covered pile of processed hogs. The animal's intelligence was evident in the way it sorted through their supplies, taking only the fresh meat and leaving behind equipment and personal belongings. When Willie attempted to drive it away with his, Remington, the mule, charged directly at their tent, forcing both men to scramble for safety. The third night brought the most terrifying encounter of all. The mule had apparently decided that intimidation wasn't sufficient, and it launched what could only be described as a coordinated assault on their camp. The boar began by systematically destroying everything within reach, using its powerful tusks to shred their tent walls and overturn their camping equipment. The animal displayed a level of intelligence that bordered on supernatural, seeming to understand exactly which actions would cause the most disruption and fear. What disturbed Hank most was the mule's timing. The boar seemed to know exactly when the two men were most vulnerable, attacking when they were sleeping or relaxing, and retreating when they were alert and armed. The animal's behavior suggested a level of tactical thinking that Hank had never encountered in any wild animal. It was as if the mule understood that psychological warfare was more effective than direct confrontation. By the fourth morning, both men had concluded that their hunting trip was over. The mule had transformed their peaceful hunting camp into a war zone, and neither man was willing to spend another night wondering when the next attack would come. They packed only their essential gear and weapons, abandoning their camping equipment and remaining food supplies to the mule's tender mercies. The drive out of the Pine Barrens was completed in tense silence, with both men constantly checking their mirrors for signs of pursuit. Hank later described the experience as the most humbling encounter of his hunting career, admitting that he had been outmaneuvered by an animal that possessed intelligence and patience he had never imagined possible. Willie never returned to the Georgia Pine Barrens, claiming that the mule had taught him to respect the intelligence of wild hogs in ways that 20 years of hunting never had. Local hunters who visited the abandoned campsite weeks later reported finding the remains of Hank and Willie's equipment scattered across a wide area, with clear evidence that the mule had continued to visit the site long after the two men had departed. The boar had apparently claimed the territory as its own, and several subsequent hunting parties reported encounters with an enormous hog that seemed to take pleasure in disrupting their activities. The Iron Ridge foothills of northern Wyoming had long been recognized as prime mule deer habitat, with their unique combination of aspen groves, sagebrush flats, and rugged canyon systems providing ideal conditions for large deer populations. In 1991, Terry Matlock had been drawn to this particular area by its reputation for producing large mule deer bucks and its relative isolation from the crowds of hunters that frequented more accessible locations. At 42 years old, Terry was a dedicated meat hunter who valued substance over trophy potential. His approach to hunting was methodical and patient, based on careful scouting and an understanding of animal behavior that had developed over 2 decades of pursuing big game throughout the American West. Terry preferred to hunt alone, believing that solo hunting allowed him to move more quietly and make decisions based on his own observations rather than group consensus. His equipment reflected his practical approach to hunting. Terry's hunting strategy relied heavily on glassing, spending hours each day behind binoculars, studying the terrain for signs of deer movement. Terry had established a temporary camp in a small grove of aspen trees, positioned to take advantage of a natural spring that provided fresh water and served as a focal point for wildlife activity. The location had been chosen after several days of scouting, during which Terry had identified multiple game trails and feeding areas. On the morning of the incident, Terry had positioned himself on a rocky outcrop that provided commanding views of 3 separate valleys. The elevation gave him the ability to glass vast areas of terrain, searching for the telltale movement or coloration that would indicate the presence of deer. The September weather had been ideal for hunting, with cool mornings that encouraged deer to move during daylight hours. Terry had been glassing for approximately 2 hours when he spotted movement in the valley below his position. Through his binoculars, he could see a herd of mule deer feeding in a natural meadow surrounded by aspen trees. The herd consisted of approximately 14 animals, including several does with fawns, and a few smaller bucks that appeared to be yearlings or young adults. The deer were behaving normally, moving slowly through the meadow and occasionally raising their heads to scan for potential threats. The scene was exactly what Terry had been hoping to find. The deer were positioned in relatively open terrain, within reasonable shooting range of his elevated position. Several of the does appeared to be mature animals that would provide excellent table fare, and their relaxed behavior suggested that they were unaware of his presence. Terry began the careful process of range estimation and shot preparation, using his spotting scope to identify the best target. What happened next was unusual in Terry's experience. The entire herd suddenly became alert, their heads turning in unison towards something Terry couldn't see from his position. The deer showed the classic statue behavior that occurs when they detect a potential threat, but haven't yet identified its exact nature or location. They remained motionless for several minutes, their ears rotating and nostrils flaring as they tried to process whatever scent or sound had triggered their alarm response. Terry watched through his spotting scope as the deer remained frozen in their alert posture, their eyes focused on something he couldn't identify. Then, without any warning calls or displays of alarm, the entire herd began moving toward the tree line in a coordinated manner, typical of mule deer when they're concerned but not yet panicked. The deer didn't bound or run as they typically would when fleeing from immediate danger, but instead moved with the deliberate, measured pace that Terry recognized as cautious retreat behavior. The herd disappeared into the aspen grove quietly, as is typical when deer are trying to avoid detection while moving away from a perceived threat. As Terry continued to watch the tree line where the deer had disappeared, he became aware of a smell that seemed to drift up from the valley below. The odor was difficult to describe, combining elements of wet fur, decay, and something else that Terry couldn't identify, but which suggested a large predator or carrion that had attracted scavengers. The smell was strong enough to be noticeable at his elevated position, suggesting that its source was both large and relatively close to his location. Terry's decision to abandon his hunt and return to camp was based on an instinct that had served him well during his years in the wilderness. Something about the entire situation felt wrong in a way that he couldn't articulate, but which triggered every survival instinct he possessed. He packed his gear quickly and began the hike back to his temporary camp, planning to break camp and leave the area immediately. The discovery of the tracks came as Terry was following his original trail back to camp. The soft earth near the spring showed clear impressions of his own boots from earlier that morning, but they were now intersected by a series of much larger tracks that followed his exact route. The tracks appeared to be from someone wearing large, worn boots, possibly an unusually large person or someone wearing oversized footwear. The impressions were partially obscured by what looked like animal tracks, suggesting that whoever had been following him was accompanied by a large dog or had been walking in areas where wildlife had also traveled. What disturbed Terry most was the realization that someone had been following his movements with systematic precision. The tracks showed that the person had followed his trail to his observation point, then returned to camp using the same route Terry had taken. The implications were clear. Someone had been tracking him throughout the morning, observing his activities and learning his patterns. Terry broke camp within 30 minutes of discovering the tracks, abandoning several items in his haste to leave the area. He hiked out of the mountains that same day, driving straight home without stopping for rest or food. The experience had shaken him so profoundly that he didn't hunt for the remainder of that season, and he never returned to Iron Ridge. Years later, Terry would describe the incident as the most unsettling experience of his hunting career. He claimed that whoever had been in the area had also been watching him, and that the deer's alert behavior had been a warning that he was fortunate to have heeded. Terry never again hunted alone in unfamiliar territory, and he never forgot the feeling of being observed by someone who possessed woodcraft skills far beyond his own and who had chosen to remain hidden rather than make contact.